All right, let's take a look at a couple of other contexts that are important to understanding Elizabethan England, Shakespeare in general, and obviously Othello in particular. I've put this next category under sort of philosophical context because it doesn't really impact, it impacts a little bit of everything. But what I want to talk about is the violence of everyday life and the commonness of death. And generally speaking, in Elizabethan England and all over Europe at this time, frankly, death is extraordinarily common and life is extraordinarily cheap. Here's what I mean. It was a really lousy time to be alive in the medieval era. We talked about that. Things improve in the Elizabethan era, but not much. The average lifespan is 35. Infant mortality is enormous, right? Between like 30 and 50%, depending on the era. The plague still comes along every once in a while, wipes out a whole lot of people. For example, 1592 to 93, that plague year kills 10,000 people. So if you go back and look at the numbers, that's like 5 to 10% of everybody in London, depending on what particular population point we're at. But yeah, that's a lot of people. We are used to death happening. It's not as upsetting to the Elizabethan English people as it is, for instance, to us nowadays. Corporal punishment is very common. Whippings and beatings are commonplace in school and in the home for children. They are normal. They are exceedingly violent, as in being whipped by your school teacher until your legs are bleeding. And they're frequent. You get beaten for a variety of very simple, low-key reasons. Inability to conjugate Latin verbs as you were supposed to, etc. And this stuff extends outwards towards violent entertainments. There are all kinds of opportunities in Elizabethan England to, instead of going to see a play, to go see some really violent sports. Bear baiting and bull baiting are common, and those are the images you see depicted here. Bear baiting is simply, imagine a circular theater in the model of the globe, take the stage out of the middle, and just chuck a bear in there, like a live wild bear, and then set a bunch of hunting dogs on him. It's a totally common entertainment, and we're just going to see how many dogs get killed if the bear wins, if the dogs win. It's going to be brutal. It's going to be awful and hard to watch for us from a modern context. But from an Elizabethan context, this is high entertainment. Cockfighting is really popular as well, and there are all sorts of stories throughout the Elizabethan era of different modifications on animals fighting each other for your entertainment. One example, there's a journal of a man from this era who wrote a story, who wrote an account of his day at the bear baiting arena, and they didn't have a bear that day. Instead, they had a monkey, and they put the monkey on a little saddle on top of a donkey. And they put the monkey and the donkey out in the middle of the arena, and then set hunting dogs upon the monkey and the donkey and had the hunting dogs tear the monkey and the donkey to pieces and kill them. Right? Now you're all gasping in horror and shock right now. The kicker is that this guy's journal describes this as one of the funniest things he'd ever seen. And that is common. This is entertaining. It's like us watching sports today. Right? The brutality of football, which is kind of in the news media right now. And we sort of root for that, not the brutality, but we root for the excitement of it. Or auto racing, you talk about wrecks. The Elizabethan English doubled and tripled down on the level of violence that we think of when we think of entertainment today. And they loved it and they enjoyed it because violence was commonplace. It was also commonplace in the legal system. Capital punishment, you could get capital punishment for things as little as stealing for a second or third time. And the idea of executing people was, and you see this illustration here on the right, an execution or a public group hanging was something that you would take your kids and a picnic lunch and go watch. This was entertainment, right? And you're also seeing justice done, right? Look at these thieves be hanged for their evil. You could get executed for anything. And on the left here, you see a painting from the era of London Bridge, right? And if you're coming from the south into London proper on the north side of the bridge, this is basically the gateway to London. You see those things on spikes right there? Those are heads. There were so many executions and beheadings, and then those were political beheadings, that there was a guy whose entire job it was to keep track of which heads were stuck on spikes on London Bridge. He was called Keeper of the Heads. That was his entire job. This stuff was common, it was completely normal, and it was staggeringly brutal. Here's one example. We know, and we'll talk about Shakespeare's life a little bit later on in the class, but we know that Shakespeare was at one point raised by Catholic schoolmasters. And because historians have sort of gone into this, he was raised by his parents, but he was taught by Catholic schoolmasters. Because historians have looked into Shakespeare's background to try to figure out who he was, where he came from. The Catholic schoolmasters, which it was a really dangerous thing to be Catholic, were, after they taught Shakespeare, completely unrelated to him, but they were accused of being traitors seeking to overthrow Queen Elizabeth and put a Catholic ruler in place. That was a realistic thing. That might have happened. These guys were not necessarily the ones who did this. Here's what happened to them, simply for the crime of being Catholic. They were hung until they were almost dead. Then their intestines were pulled out through their stomachs. Their stomachs were cut open, their intestines were pulled out. Then they were beheaded. Then, just for good measure, they were cut into quarters. Again, totally common, completely normal, everyday understanding of the commonness of death, the cheapness of life, and this sort of notion that violence is a part of what we do every day. So, how does this world of Elizabethan England impact how we see Shakespeare's plays in general, and Othello in particular? Tell me why and how the violence is depicted in Othello. Find a particular place. Show me how it works. Now, let's talk about women. You would think that with Elizabeth I, a queen on the throne, that this would be an era of, relatively liberal thinking in terms of how women should be treated. Possibly even maybe a feminist era. Not true at all. Not even a little bit, right? This is an illustration from a sort of etiquette manual of the day, talking about how women must be escorted at all times and how gentlemen, how the conduct of women around men must be carefully monitored at all times. Women in the Elizabethan era, just like every era before, are legally and socially no more than wives. They're subservient to their husbands. They're basically owned by their husbands. Not legally owned like slaves, but in every other context, pretty much. They don't know how to read. Unlike the rest of England, there's enormously high female illiteracy in this era. 90% is a rough estimate. And this is across the board. Women were not seen as people to be educated or to engage in education. In public, and again, refer back to this little etiquette manual, they were seen as a protected species. You don't go out of the house. If you're a middle or upper class woman especially, you do not leave the house unless you are escorted. People who are escorted are right, moral, upstanding women. People who are unescorted are probably prostitutes. That's just the simple stereotype that we give in this era when you see a woman out by herself. Like, probably prostitute, immoral woman. They must be protected, which is a ridiculous and sort of overbearing idea, but certainly true during the era. Now, there weren't any women on the stages of the Playhouse. As we know, every female role in Shakespeare's era was played by a man in cross-dress, right? But Shakespeare's not dumb. There are a lot of women who go see theater. And while they may not be literate, and while they may not control exactly what they can do, they're going to the shows. So Shakespeare's a smart guy. He's not going to write a radical feminist play, but he might write a handful of plays, maybe more than a few, that give a thoughtful and interesting consideration of what it means to be a woman. Does Othello do this? As you read the play, consider, all right, he can't be a radical, so I promise you this play supports existing perceptions of gender at the time. But I would also argue that in some sneaky ways, and in some very direct ways, it challenges a lot of those perceptions of gender. And it's a relatively progressive play in that regard. Just something to consider as you read. But this is what it's like to be a woman in Elizabethan England. Unless you're the queen, and you don't have a whole lot of power. Now, race and nationality. As England develops economic power and military power and naval power, right, the Spanish Armada falls apart, and England then becomes, along with France, sort of, and the Dutch, the primary power on the seas of the world. This results in an expansion of the English Empire and an age of exploration. And we're talking about a time when, here's a nice little sort of historical map of the known world around 1600. This is pretty amazing. I mean, there's a lot of it that's obviously really wrong in terms of being accurate, but this is a time when England in particular, but lots of European nations are sailing out into the world and trying to discover things. That brings us contact with foreign, mysterious, unknown people, unknown things, right? Imported goods from far away, et cetera, et cetera. And this is a really exciting time. Here's a little historical crossover that I always love to think about. Jamestown, Virginia, which was one of the first English colonies, was founded in 1607. Shakespeare was still alive. So there's a crossover between the beginnings of America, at least colonial America, and Shakespeare's lifetime. Now, he doesn't refer to it explicitly in any of his plays. It's just kind of an interesting illustration that while Shakespeare's writing plays, the big, scary world outside of England is being investigated and considered. And, right, so there's excitingness, there's excitement to all this, but there's also some threat and some fear. This is also the era where we are drawing maps that speculate the crazy, wild sea monsters that are out there. They're going to swallow up whole ships. So in addition to exploration and excitement, there's also some fear here. We also talk a lot about cannibals in Shakespeare's day, right? Foreign, dark-skinned people who I'll talk about in a second. But there's also some, right, interaction with cultures and ideas that are different and foreign and scary. Here's a side note. Most of Shakespeare's plays are set outside of England, in places where his audience would never have gone. Even the wealthy people in England probably aren't going to go much further than, maybe to Belgium, the Low Countries, Netherlands, France, maybe all the way down to Italy. But can you imagine in Elizabethan England how long it takes to get from London to Italy? Like, why would you do that? You could, but it takes a lot of money and time. The vast majority of everybody standing in the Globe Theatre watching Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, etc., has never left England and never will. But all of his plays are set far away. How come? So, in this discovery of people from faraway places, we develop this idea of otherness. And what otherness simply means is anything that is not like us. So in Elizabethan England, everybody's white because they came from England, right? The other, one of the big notions of otherness is anyone with dark skin in this era. And those people are different, foreign, right? Unfamiliar, frequently scary, and most importantly, they can be objectified, right? So in Elizabethan England, you label somebody simply by their race. That means that they are not English, they are not white. So the notion of the words Negro and Blackamoor are thrown around a lot. And once I label somebody that, I've now given them all kinds of really complex baggage. And the notions of dark skin of really problematic connections, metaphors of dirt, of sin, of death. And we see this all throughout Elizabethan writing, poetry, playwriting, all that, right? The fact that your skin is black in this era is something that is seen as a metaphor for the devil. It's hugely problematic, obviously. Here's one example. This is a 1586 illustration demonstrating that you cannot wash an Ethiop, and that's an African person, white. That this black skin is, and the language that accompanies this illustration is what you would expect along the lines of like a stain. So there's some really problematic ways in which Elizabethan people view dark-skinned people, specifically, right, those from Africa, which obviously is pertinent to Othello. There's Othello, one of our dark-skinned topic people, right? Also, in addition to being a dark-skinned other, there comes along with this a dangerous sexuality. This is an idea that because they are savage and heathen, dark-skinned people, especially those of African descent, are also sort of voraciously sexual, and that they will come in to England or to wherever and rape white women because they can't control themselves. Hugely problematic, deeply racist beliefs, but fairly well ingrained in Elizabethan English society. If you know anything about America in the South, in both pre- and post-Civil War era, the idea of a black man raping a white woman was one of the most common reasons for lynching a black man, because that notion of dangerous sexuality continued on throughout Western culture for a really long time. The vast majority of those lynchings had nothing to do with rape. It was simply the accusation or the idea that that black man might have or could have done something wrong. It's really, really awful. But it comes from these original ideas of darkness and otherness and sort of faraway people. In 1601, Elizabeth calls for the deportation of all Negroes and Blackamoors from England. Basically, she says there are foreigners on our turf. I don't want them here. Some of them would come in from Africa for trading purposes. You can imagine, a North African sort of person coming in to trade with an English merchant, etc. Everybody has to leave, says Elizabeth. She wants England to be pure and for the English and Europeans, obviously, but mainly just white people. So when Othello's on stage, there aren't black people walking around England. We don't see them. So what we see on stage is a really interesting idea. First off, anytime you see a black person on stage in an Elizabethan play, it's obviously a white person in really problematic, offensive black makeup. But if we're scared of these people, if they're far away and foreign, and we have all these ideas about they're evil and devious and all these really awful things, what are they doing on the stage in the first place? We tend to look at plays and see this voyeuristic motivation. That is, I'm going to put a black character on the stage so I can look and examine how evil he is and sort of take delight in that evil, but then also keep that evil at a safe distance. It's a little bit like why we have horrific characters and human beings in horror movies nowadays, right? You can experience that horror, but do it from a safe distance. And there are all kinds of examples of this throughout all of Elizabethan theater, where there's a black character who comes in and is the bad guy, or is like a supporting bad guy. And that's so we, the audience, can go, oh, they're really awful. Aaron the Moor in Shakespeare's Titus Andronicus is one of the bad guys and has some serious problematic racial traits. So Shakespeare himself was not immune to this. But the interesting one is, in the original Italian version of the story of Othello, written by a guy named Cinthio, the moral of the original version of Othello is a sort of finger-wagging warning. Hey, white people, don't marry dark-skinned foreigners. It's really bad if you do that. So that's the play on which Shakespeare based Othello. It had that inherent moral to it. I want to work on the assumption that Shakespeare was racist. He couldn't help but be racist in this era, but significantly less racist than most of his audience. How is he using Othello to change his audience's mind without making them mad? You can't be a radical in this day, right? Why would he even want to take that risk? Why would he choose Othello as a story? And then how does he handle Othello as a character? Does Othello support all of my racist ideas as an Elizabethan person? Or does he complicate them in some ways? We'll talk about this obviously in discussion in class, but this might be an opportunity for a notation. And that will end our conversation about Elizabethan English history. Thanks.